When we talk about trauma, most people imagine big events, or abuse, violence, accidents, the obvious stuff. The kinds of experiences that are so overwhelming and so painful that they leave a mark on the nervous system. And of course, those things are trauma. But when we talk about core trauma, what we're pointing to is something even deeper than a single event. Core trauma is the wound at the center of your being that shapes how you see the world, how you see yourself, and how you make decisions, often without realizing it. It's not always the thing that happened once. Sometimes it's the thing that happened over and over. The feeling that you weren't good enough, the belief that love could be taken away, the experience of never feeling safe. Those impressions sink down into your subconscious and become the lens through which you live your life. The fascinating and heartbreaking thing about core trauma is that it doesn't just live in the past. You carry it with you. It whispers in your ear when you're making choices. It nudges you towards certain paths and away from others. It affects who you trust, who you love, what risks you take, what dreams you chase, what fears you avoid. Most of the time, you don't even realize it's there. You think you're making rational decisions. You think you're choosing freely. But in reality, your trauma is pulling strings behind the curtain. And until you bring it into the light, it will keep steering your life. Imagine a child who grows up in a home where love is conditional. Maybe every time they make a mistake, their parent withdraws affection. Maybe they only get attention when they succeed. That child internalizes the lesson that their worth depends on performance. And so, as an adult, every decision they make will be colored by the need to prove themselves. They'll choose jobs not because they love them, but because they want recognition. They'll stay in relationships not because they feel safe, but because they're terrified of being abandoned. On the surface, they may look ambitious, hardworking, high-achieving, but underneath, every choice is driven by the fear that if they stop performing, they'll stop being loved. That's core trauma in action. Or think about a child who grew up in chaos, where things were unpredictable, where anger or violence could erupt at any moment. That child learns to scan the environment constantly, to anticipate danger, to stay small and avoid attention. As an adult, they may become risk-averse. They'll avoid new opportunities, they'll stick to routines, they'll be terrified of change. To other people, they may look cautious, maybe even boring. But what is really happening is that their nervous system still remembers what it was like to live in danger. And so their decisions are not about thriving, they're about surviving. One of the trickiest parts about core trauma is that it hides in plain sight. The patterns feel so normal to you that you don't even notice them. If you grew up believing you're unworthy, then constantly sacrificing yourself for others feels natural. If you grew up with criticism, then second-guessing yourself feels normal. If you grew up neglected, then clinging to people who give you even scraps of attention feels obvious. You don't question it because it's the water you've always swum in. But the cost is that you're not actually living your life freely. You're living your trauma's life. Now, let's talk about the neuroscience for a moment because this is important. Trauma doesn't just live in your thoughts, it lives in your body. When you experience something overwhelming as a child, your brain is still developing. The amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for fear and threat detection, becomes overactive. The hippocampus, which helps distinguish past from present, can shrink. The prefrontal cortex, which regulates impulses and rational thought, struggles to develop properly under stress. What this means is that your nervous system gets wired around the trauma. Even years later, when you're technically safe, your body still responds as if you're in danger. This is why trauma survivors overreact to small triggers. Their brain isn't overreacting, it's responding exactly the way it was trained to. This wiring is why trauma affects decisions. When you're faced with a choice, your brain doesn't just calculate the pros and cons, it consults your nervous system. And if your nervous system is wired to expect abandonment, then you'll choose to cling. If it's wired to expect danger, you'll choose to avoid risk. If it's wired to expect failure, you'll choose not to try. Your trauma speaks through your body, and your body nudges your decisions. Another example. Let's say you had a parent who was emotionally unavailable. You learned as a child that your feelings didn't matter, that no one would really show up for you. As an adult, you may find yourself attracted to partners who are also emotionally unavailable. You might tell yourself you just have a type, but really, your trauma is steering you toward the familiar. Even though it hurts, it feels normal. It feels like home. And so you keep choosing the same kind of partner, the same kind of dynamic over and over again. That's not just bad luck in relationships. That's trauma replaying itself in your decisions. What's even more subtle is how trauma can affect positive decisions. For instance, some people with core trauma become overachievers. They're driven, successful, admired. On the surface, this looks like a good thing. But if you look underneath, you often find a desperate attempt to escape the feeling of worthlessness. Every award, every promotion, every accomplishment is not about joy. It's about survival. And the tragedy is, no matter how much they achieve, it's never enough. Because the trauma wound whispers, you're still not good enough. And so they keep running, keep striving, keep burning out, all because of a decision-making process that's rooted in pain. Now, here's where things get even more complex. Trauma doesn't just shape the big decisions, like who you marry or what career you choose. It shapes the small, everyday ones too. The choice to avoid a phone call because you don't want to disappoint someone. The choice to stay silent in a meeting because you're afraid of looking stupid. The choice to eat when you're not hungry because food soothes the emptiness. Each of these decisions may seem minor, but together they create the entire architecture of your life. And if the architecture is built on trauma, then the whole building tilts. So how do we begin to free ourselves from this invisible puppeteer? The first step is awareness. You have to start noticing when a decision feels bigger than it should, when the fear you feel is disproportionate, when the shame you feel doesn't match the situation. Those are signs that your trauma is in the driver's seat. For example, if your boss gives you constructive feedback and you feel like curling up and crying, that's not just about the feedback. That's about your childhood wound of not being good enough. If your partner doesn't text you back for a few hours and you spiral into panic, that's not just about the text. That's about your wound of abandonment. Awareness means asking yourself, what wound is this touching? Once you start to see the patterns, the next step is to pause. Trauma drives impulsivity. It makes you want to react immediately, lash out, withdraw, cling, numb. But if you can create even a small pause, a few seconds of space, you can start to separate the past from the present. You can remind yourself, I'm not that child anymore. I'm not powerless anymore. I have choices now. That pause is where healing begins, because it's where you start to reclaim your agency. Over time, as you keep practicing awareness and pausing, you can start to rewire your nervous system. This is where therapy, meditation, journaling, safe relationships all come in. Each time you face a trigger and respond differently, you're teaching your brain a new pattern. You're showing your amygdala that not every raised voice means danger. You're showing your hippocampus that the past is not the present. You're strengthening your prefrontal cortex to regulate instead of react. Little by little, the trauma loses its grip on your decisions. But let's be honest, this is not easy work. Because facing your trauma means feeling pain you've avoided for years. It means grieving the childhood you didn't have, the love you didn't get, the safety you never felt. It means confronting the reality that many of your decisions were not truly free, but were shaped by wounds you never asked for. That's heartbreaking. But it's also liberating, because once you see it, you can start to change it. And here's the beautiful truth. The same wound that distorted your decisions can also become the source of your wisdom. Once you heal, you don't just stop making trauma-driven choices, you start making soul-driven choices. You can choose partners out of love instead of fear. You can choose careers out of passion instead of desperation. You can choose risks out of curiosity instead of terror. Your life stops being a repetition of old pain and becomes an expression of your true self. When you start to peel back the layers of your life, you realize that almost nothing is untouched by trauma. The friends you gravitate toward, the way you spend money, the way you handle conflict, Even the way you treat your own body. These are not just random habits. They are adaptations. They are strategies your younger self developed to survive a world that felt unsafe or unloving. And those strategies made sense when you were small. But the tragedy is that you carry them into adulthood long after they've stopped serving you. Think about how many people self-sabotage. They procrastinate on projects, they quit when things get hard, they undermine their own success. On the surface, that looks like laziness or lack of discipline. But if you look underneath, you often find trauma, because for some kids, success was dangerous. Maybe every time they shined, a parent got jealous and tore them down. Maybe every time they achieved something, expectations only rose higher and they never got to rest. So, as adults, part of them believes that succeeding will only bring more pain. So they delay, they sabotage, they stall, not because they're weak, but because their trauma has taught them that safety lies in staying small. Or consider the opposite, the person who never stops working. They're up late at night, chasing one more goal, terrified of falling behind. From the outside, they look like the picture of ambition. But if you sit with them long enough, you'll hear the trembling in their voice. Because deep down, they are terrified that if they stop achieving, the love will vanish. They can't rest, because rest feels like worthlessness. That's not just drive, that's trauma in disguise. The way trauma infiltrates relationships is especially powerful. If your core wound is abandonment, then every decision in love will be tinged with desperation. You'll stay in relationships far longer than you should, tolerating mistreatment, because the fear of being left feels worse than the pain of staying. Or you'll become clingy and controlling, constantly checking, constantly needing reassurance because your nervous system cannot tolerate distance. What looks like love is often trauma, screaming, "Don't leave me." On the flip side, if your trauma wound is engulfment, if you grew up with a parent who smothered you, controlled you, intruded on your boundaries, then your adult decisions may swing the other way. You'll avoid intimacy, you'll push people away, you'll keep your independence at all costs. And you'll tell yourself you just like freedom, but what's really happening is that closeness feels dangerous, because your body remembers being trapped. Again, it's not really a free choice. It's a trauma-driven defense. Even money is shaped by trauma. Some people hoard money, terrified of spending, always saving for a rainy day that never comes. That usually comes from childhood scarcity, where every penny mattered, where you never knew if you'd have enough. Others do the opposite. They spend recklessly, chasing the high of buying, trying to fill an emptiness inside. Sometimes they grew up deprived, so every purchase feels like a rebellion. Sometimes they grew up neglected, so spending becomes a way of self-soothing. Either way, the decisions about money are not purely rational. They are colored by emotional wounds. The body itself becomes a battlefield of trauma decisions. Some people overeat, not because they lack willpower, but because food was the only comfort they ever had. Others starve themselves, chasing thinness, because somewhere deep down they believe that if they look perfect, they'll finally be loved. Exercise, grooming, sleep, these too are shaped by the unconscious beliefs planted in childhood. The trauma tells you whether your body is a home or a prison. And let's not forget conflict. How you argue, how you fight, how you disagree, that too is rooted in trauma. If you grew up in a household where anger was explosive and terrifying, then as an adult you may shut down completely in conflict. You freeze, you go silent because your body remembers what it was like to be powerless in the face of rage. Or you may go the opposite direction, you explode first, yelling, trying to seize control, because as a child, the only way to survive was to fight back before the blow landed. These patterns repeat themselves not because you consciously choose them, but because your nervous system is conditioned. So here's the big insight. Trauma is not just the memory of what happened. It's the adaptation you made in response. And those adaptations become the blueprint for your entire life, which means that until you bring awareness to them, every decision you make is at least partly an echo of the past. You think you're choosing your future, but really you're reenacting your history. And here's where people often get stuck. They say, but I had a good childhood. I was never abused. I was never neglected. And yet they still struggle with anxiety, depression, self-sabotage. How can that be trauma? What most people don't realize is that trauma is not only about what happened to you, it's also about what didn't happen. The hug you didn't get, the apology you never heard, the validation you longed for but never received. Emotional neglect leaves wounds just as deep as overt abuse. In fact, sometimes it's harder to heal from because it's invisible. There's no obvious event to point to, just a lifelong ache that you can't quite explain. Let us take the example of a child who grew up in a family where everything looked fine on the outside. No shouting, no hitting, no chaos. But inside there was emotional distance. The parents worked long hours, or they were caught up in their own struggles, or they simply didn't know how to connect. That child learns to stop asking for attention. They learn to suppress their feelings. They learn that vulnerability leads to emptiness. And so, as adults, they become hyper-independent. They don't ask for help. They don't show weakness. They pride themselves on being self-sufficient. Society praises them for being strong. But deep inside, they feel lonely, disconnected, unseen. Their decisions to not rely on anyone, to keep everything inside, to avoid intimacy, are all shaped by the trauma of what didn't happen. When we look at the brain, we see how this works. The human nervous system is built to attach. We are wired for connection. When that connection is absent, the brain adapts. The child's stress response becomes dysregulated. Their cortisol levels spike. Their attachment system either becomes hyperactive, constantly searching for connection, or hypoactive, shutting down the desire altogether. These patterns solidify into adulthood, where they play out in every relationship, every friendship, every workplace dynamic. So when we talk about trauma shaping decisions, it's not just poetic, it's literally neurological. And here's where it gets especially tricky. Trauma doesn't only make us avoid certain paths. Sometimes it pushes us into the exact situations that hurt us in the first place. Psychologists call this repetition compulsion. The unconscious drive to recreate the old wound in hopes of finally healing it. That's why people who grew up with critical parents often marry critical partners. That's why people who grew up abandoned often choose partners who are distant. On the surface, it makes no sense. Why would you choose the thing that hurt you? But on a deep level, your psyche is hoping that this time the story will end differently. This time, maybe the critical person will finally give you approval. This time, maybe the distant partner will finally stay. The decisions feel self-destructive, but they're actually attempts at self-healing. Tragically, they usually just recreate the pain. So if trauma is this pervasive, if it infiltrates every corner of our decision-making, what does healing even look like? First, it requires compassion. Because so many of us beat ourselves up for the decisions we make. Why did I stay in that relationship? Why do I keep messing up at work? Why can't I just get it together? But if you understand that those decisions were never purely choices, but were influenced by wounds you didn't choose, you can start to soften. You can see yourself not as a failure, but as someone who adapted brilliantly to survive. That reframe is crucial, because shame locks trauma in place. Compassion starts to unlock it. Healing also requires patience, because these patterns were wired into your nervous system over years, sometimes decades. They won't unravel overnight. Every time you notice a trauma-driven reaction and pause instead of acting, you're building a new neural pathway. Every time you set a boundary where you used to collapse, you're rewiring. Every time you open up where you used to shut down, you're teaching your body that safety is possible. And those small moments accumulate. They add up to freedom. One of the most powerful tools for healing is safe relationships, because trauma happens in relationships, and so it must be healed in relationships. Therapy is one example. A good therapist becomes the parent you never had, consistent, safe, non-judgmental. But it doesn't have to be therapy. A supportive friend, a loving partner, even a community can provide the corrective experiences you need. When someone shows up for you again and again, when they don't leave when you're messy, when they listen without judgment, Your nervous system slowly learns that the old patterns are not inevitable. You can be seen and still loved. You can be flawed and still accepted. And once your body learns that, your decisions start to change naturally. Meditation is another tool because it helps create that pause between trigger and response. When you sit and watch your thoughts, you begin to see the trauma stories play out in your head. You hear the voice that says you're not good enough, and you realize it's not truth, it's memory. You feel the panic rising, and you learn to breathe through it instead of reacting. Over time, that awareness becomes a superpower. You can recognize when a decision is trauma-driven and choose differently. Journaling, too, can be powerful. Writing about your experiences gives you distance. It helps you see patterns. It gives words to feelings that were once only sensations. And once something is named, it loses some of its power. What was once an invisible puppeteer becomes a visible influence, and visibility gives you a chance to resist. It's important to remember, though, that healing doesn't mean erasing the trauma. The wound will always be part of your story, but it doesn't have to be the author of your decisions. It can become just one chapter, not the whole book. In fact, some of the deepest wisdom comes from people who have faced trauma and healed. They carry empathy, resilience, insight that others don't. They can make decisions not just from logic, but from lived understanding of suffering and compassion. So when you ask yourself, why did I choose this path? Why do I keep making these mistakes? The answer is rarely because you're broken. The answer is because you recarrying wounds that shaped you in ways you couldn't control. And the good news is you can start to unshape them. You can start to live not as the traumatized child, but as the adult who has choices. You can bring your unconscious patterns into consciousness, and in doing so, you begin to reclaim your life. And this is the ultimate freedom. To make decisions not from fear, not from shame, not from scarcity, but from love, from curiosity, from authentic desire. That's when you know the trauma is no longer in charge. That's when you know you are finally steering your own ship.